Get her out of here! Right now!
Your patient is dying, and you don't have anyone else.
I have 40 minutes. You have a hairnet and a cafeteria uniform. Don't waste my time.
Whitfield turned his back like the conversation was over. He had no idea he'd just made the biggest mistake of his 11-year career, standing in front of the one person in this entire building who could actually save his patient. I'm not telling you this to take sides. I'm telling you because I was there. I counted every second, and I know the exact moment he realized he was wrong. Here's what nobody talks about. How many brilliant people get looked straight through every single day just because they're wearing the wrong uniform? Stay with me, because what happened next changed everything. The 5:15 a.m. bus was always the same. Same cracked plastic seat by the window. Same flickering overhead light that nobody had fixed in 3 years. Same handful of people who never made eye contact. Night shift nurses heading home, hotel workers heading in, a man in paint-stained jeans who slept with his chin on his chest from the first stop to the last. Camille Washington had ridden this bus for 12 years. She knew every pothole on Piedmont Avenue. She knew which driver would wait an extra 30 seconds if he saw someone running, and which one would pull away without blinking. She knew that if she got the 5:15, she'd clock in by 5:48, which gave her exactly 9 minutes to tie her apron, check the steam trays, and have the breakfast line ready before the first doctors came down at 6. 9 minutes. Not 10, not 8. 9, that kind of precision wasn't ambition. It was survival. The job paid $17.40 an hour. After taxes, after the $140 a month she sent to her mother in Savannah, after the electric bill and the transit card and the one prescription she kept putting off refilling, there wasn't much left. Some months the math worked. Some months she moved things around and told herself next month would be different. It never looked different from the outside. But she kept the lights on. She kept the refrigerator running. She kept showing up. What nobody on that bus knew, what nobody at Grady Memorial knew, was what Camille did with every quiet minute she could find. Not scrolling, not watching anything, studying. She had a notebook in her apron pocket right now, filled front to back with vocabulary she'd written by hand, then rewritten, then tested herself on in the dark. The edges were soft from handling. Some pages had coffee stains from the counter. A few had small grease marks from the morning rush. 9 languages lived in those pages. Not 9 phrases. Not 9 greetings for tourists. 9 complete systems. Grammar, syntax, the particular rhythm of how people from a certain place put sentences together when they're scared, or grateful, or trying to explain something that matters. She hadn't told anyone at work. Not because she was hiding it, but because no one had ever asked what she did when she wasn't handing them their plates. The bus lurched to a stop on Coca-Cola Place. Camille closed her notebook, tucked it into her pocket, and stepped off into the dark. Another day. There was a rule Camille had made for herself a long time ago. Not a motto, not something she'd written on a wall or said out loud to anyone, just a line she'd drawn somewhere inside herself and decided not to cross. She would not shrink to make other people comfortable. That sounds simple. It wasn't. Not when you're the person behind the counter. Not when the dynamic of every single interaction is built around the assumption that you are there to serve and they are there to be served. And the moment you speak first, or hold eye contact a beat too long, or answer a question with more than 3 words, something shifts in the room, and people don't know what to do with you. She had learned that early, the hard way. When she was 29, she'd worked at a downtown hotel, front desk. She was good at it. Fast, calm, fluent in the specific language of de-escalating guests who'd had a bad flight and were taking it out on whoever was standing in front of them. Her manager at the time had pulled her aside one afternoon and told her she was too much, too direct, too confident for the position. Guests want to feel like they're in charge, he'd said. Camille had nodded. She'd gone home, and she'd spent a long time thinking about whether to make herself smaller or find somewhere else to be. She found somewhere else. Not because she was too proud to adapt, because she understood the difference between adapting and disappearing, and she wasn't willing to disappear. That same instinct was what made her a precise worker, not just a fast one. She didn't cut corners because corners had a way of becoming the thing that got you. She didn't guess at measurements or approximate temperatures or assume a tray was clean because it looked clean. She verified. She checked. She built habits that worked whether or not anyone was watching, especially when no one was watching. There's a version of discipline that comes from wanting to be recognized, Camille's didn't come from that. It came from something quieter, a belief that the work itself was the record, that if you did things right consistently, the truth had a way of being legible even when no one was reading it yet. She thought about that sometimes on the early bus, before the city woke up. If the system never sees you clearly, you still have to see yourself clearly, because the day it finally looks, you need to already be exactly what you've always been. Not a revolution, just a woman on a bus, notebook in her pocket, building something no one had thought to ask about. She had 9 languages. She had 12 years of showing up on time. She had a way of watching a room and understanding it before she said a single word. None of that was visible in the gray uniform. But it was all there. The letter had been sitting on her kitchen table for 6 days. Camille had read it 4 times. Each time she set it down in the same spot, face down, like not seeing the words would change what they said. It didn't. The building had been sold. New ownership. The kind that came in with fresh paint and recalculated numbers, and a very polite way of saying that long-term tenants at below market rates were a liability they weren't interested in carrying. Her rent was going up, not gradually. Not the kind of increase you could absorb by cutting one thing here and one thing there, 41%, effective in 60 days. She had done the math 3 times because she didn't trust herself to do it right when her hands were cold. The result was the same every time. At her current salary, after everything fixed and non-negotiable, the new number didn't work. Not by a little, by a lot. 60 days was the clock. Not 60 days to find more money. She already knew what more money looked like and didn't look like at $17.40 an hour. 60 days to find a different apartment in a city where the listings she could afford were 40 minutes further from the bus line, which meant a different route, which meant she'd have to leave the house at 4:30 instead of 4:50, which meant less time to study, which meant she stopped herself there. She knew how these chains worked. One link pulled, and then the whole thing shifted. She had applied for a senior cafeteria coordinator position 8 months ago. More responsibility, slightly better pay, enough to matter. She'd been told the decision was pending. She'd followed up twice. The second time, her supervisor had looked uncomfortable in a way that meant the answer was no, but no one wanted to say it out loud. She hadn't pushed. She'd gone back to the line. Now she was looking at that letter again and thinking that maybe she should have pushed. Not for her pride, for the math. The clock was running. 60 days sounds like a long time until you're inside it, working the breakfast line at 6 in the morning, watching doctors carry coffee past you without looking up, and doing arithmetic in your head that keeps coming out wrong. She put the letter back down, face down. She had 54 days left. It started 3 weeks before the morning everything changed. A Tuesday, slow breakfast service. The kind of morning where the cafeteria felt too large for the number of people in it, and every sound carried further than it should. Camille was restocking the juice station when she noticed the woman, late 20s. Dark skin, high cheekbones, the particular kind of exhaustion that wasn't from one bad night but from weeks of not sleeping right. She was sitting alone at the far table by the window, picking at a container of yogurt she clearly wasn't eating, staring at nothing. What made Camille look twice wasn't the exhaustion. Half the people in this cafeteria were exhausted. It was the way the woman was holding her phone, not scrolling, not texting. Gripping it with both hands in her lap, screen dark, like it was the only solid thing available. And every few minutes, she'd look up at the door. Not the way people look when they're waiting for someone. The way people look when they're calculating whether to leave. Camille had seen that look before. She'd seen it on her cousin in 2009, sitting in a parking lot outside a clinic, 3 hours after she was supposed to go inside. She'd seen it on a woman at a bus stop in the rain who kept letting the bus come and go. She'd seen it on herself once in a bathroom mirror before she decided the hard thing was still the right thing. She didn't approach the woman. It wasn't her place, and she knew the difference between noticing and intruding. But she paid attention. Over the next 4 days, the woman came back. Not every day, but enough. Always alone. Always the same table. Always that phone gripped in both hands. On the third visit, Camille caught a fragment of conversation. The woman was on a call, speaking quietly, and the language wasn't English. It wasn't Spanish. It wasn't French. Camille set down the tray she was carrying. She listened for exactly 11 seconds. Then she went back to work and said nothing, but she filed it. The way she filed everything. Not in a notebook this time, but in the part of her mind that kept running quietly in the background while her hands were busy doing something else. a language she recognized but hadn't spoken in 2 years, a community center on Wednesday nights. A woman who kept coming back to the same table and looking at the door like she was deciding something. None of it connected yet. She didn't force it to. That was the thing about paying attention. You didn't get to choose when it became useful. You just had to keep doing it and trust that the pieces were going somewhere even when the picture wasn't clear. 3 weeks later, it became very clear. The morning it happened, Camille heard the commotion before she saw it. A gurney moving fast. Voices overlapping in that specific register that meant something had gone past urgent into critical. She stepped to the side of the service corridor and watched the team push through the double doors toward pre-op. She saw the girl's face. It was the woman from the cafeteria. Same cheekbones. Same exhaustion. Except now it was something worse than exhaustion. It was the white, hollow look of a body in shock fighting something it didn't have language for. She was conscious. Barely. Her hands were gripping the gurney rails the same way they'd gripped that phone. Camille stood still for a moment. Then she went back to the breakfast line, because that was her job and the clock said 8:47 and there were still trays to run. But something sat wrong. She'd seen Diana Torres, charge nurse, 3rd floor, the kind of person who moved through a crisis like she'd rehearsed it, come through the cafeteria doorway twice in 10 minutes. First time on the phone, face tight. Second time still on the phone, slower, looking around the room in a way that wasn't looking for coffee. That was the tell. When someone like Diana Torres starts scanning a room like that, it means the normal systems have failed, and she's doing the thing experienced people do when they run out of options. She's looking at everything, including the things she'd normally walk past. Camille made a decision before Diana reached her, not an emotional decision, a calculated one. She knew what language that woman spoke. She knew it because she'd spent 2 years studying it on Wednesday nights at a community center 12 blocks from this hospital. She knew it well enough to explain a medical procedure. She knew it well enough to answer questions. She knew it well enough to matter. The question wasn't whether she could help. The question was what it would cost her to step forward. If she walked into that room and was wrong about the language, she'd look like a cafeteria worker who didn't know her place. If she walked in and was right, but the doctors didn't listen, same result. If she walked in, was right, they listened, and something still went wrong, she'd be the name people remembered. She understood all 3 risks in the time it took Diana to cross the cafeteria floor. Here's what I want you to think about. If you knew you could help someone, but stepping forward meant putting everything you had on the line, what would you actually do? Camille set down her cloth. What language? She said. Diana said, we don't even know exactly. West African, maybe. Some kind of Creole. Camille didn't answer immediately. 2 seconds. Maybe 3. Not because she didn't know. She knew. But because she was running the full picture in her head one more time before she committed to anything she couldn't take back. The woman on that gurney was from Guinea-Bissau. The language was Criollo. She was almost certain, not from one fragment overheard in a cafeteria, but from 3 separate visits, 2 partial conversations, and a particular phrasing she'd written down in her notebook the night after the second visit because it had sounded familiar in a way she wanted to verify. She had verified it. So the language wasn't the question. The question was the room she'd be walking into. She knew Whitfield by reputation. Everyone in the building did. 11 years, no procedural errors. The kind of surgeon whose confidence had calcified over time into something that looked a lot like certainty about everything, including things that had nothing to do with surgery. She'd served him breakfast maybe 200 times. He had never once looked at her face. She ran the calculation. If she went in and he accepted her help immediately, the patient lived and Camille went back to the breakfast line. Best case. If she went in and he refused, which was more likely, she'd have to decide in real time whether to push back against a senior surgeon in his own pre-op room in front of his team, with no institutional standing and no one to back her up. And if she pushed back and he still refused and the patient died, that image, the cafeteria worker who showed up uninvited and couldn't stop it, would follow her in ways she couldn't fully predict. She knew all of this. She went anyway, not because the risk disappeared. Because she decided it was the kind of risk you take when the alternative is watching someone die in a room full of people who couldn't reach her. Some decisions aren't really decisions. They're just the moment you stop pretending you have a choice. Take me to her, Camille said. Diana looked at her watch. Then she moved. The pre-op room had 4 people in it when Camille walked through the door. Whitfield, 2 residents, a nurse she didn't recognize. All of them moving with the compressed urgency of people who had run out of good options and were cycling through bad ones. Then Whitfield turned around. He looked at Camille the way people look at something that has appeared in the wrong context. Not anger yet, just the brief malfunction of a mind trying to categorize something that doesn't fit. Then he saw the hairnet, the gray uniform, the hospital logo on the chest that said food services. "What is this?" "She says she can help," Diana said. Whitfield looked at Camille for exactly 2 seconds. The kind of look that takes a full inventory and returns a verdict without asking a single question. "She works in the cafeteria." "I speak 9 languages," Camille said. Calm level. Not asking for his approval and not apologizing for being in the room. Stating a fact the same way you'd state the temperature outside. "And your patient is dying, so." Nobody moved. The monitor beside Amara's bed marked the silence in steady beats. Whitfield's expression didn't shift into acceptance. It shifted into something more reluctant than that. The look of a man who has run the numbers and doesn't like the answer but can't argue with the math. He had 38 minutes. He had no interpreter. He had a patient who would not sign. He stepped aside. It wasn't gracious. It wasn't an acknowledgement. It was a man moving out of a doorway because the alternative was worse. Camille walked to the bedside. She didn't look at Whitfield. She didn't look at the residents or the monitor or the consent form on the tray table. She looked at Amara, 26 years old, gray pale, gripping the rails with both hands, eyes tracking every person in the room with the specific terror of someone who understands that something serious is happening and cannot access a single word of explanation. Camille had thought about what she would say on the walk down the hallway. Not the translation. She knew the translation. She'd thought about the tone, the register, the difference between speaking at someone in their language and speaking with them in it. The difference between a voice that says, "I need you to comply," and a voice that says, "I see you and you are not alone." She chose the second one. She opened her mouth. And she spoke Criollo the way you speak to someone from the same street, the same rain, the same world. Amara froze. Not the frozen of fear. The frozen of someone who has been underwater for a long time and suddenly breaks the surface and doesn't know yet if they're allowed to breathe. Her eyes went wide. Then her face did something that faces do when the thing they've been bracing against stops. All the held tension releasing at once, in one direction. She started crying, not quietly. The kind of crying that has been waiting behind a wall of incomprehension for hours, and now the wall is gone and everything comes through at once. The residents shifted uncomfortably. The nurse looked at the floor. Whitfield stood very still. Camille didn't reach for the consent form. Not yet. She talked first. 4 minutes, maybe a little more. She explained what was happening inside Amara's body in terms a person could hold on to. She described what the surgery would involve, not the clinical version, the human version. She said the team was skilled. She said the room was safe. She said, "I know this is frightening, and I know you came here alone, and I know none of this is what you expected." She said it all in Criollo. Then she asked Amara if she had questions. Amara had 2. Camille answered both. Then she picked up the consent form, explained each section in plain language, and asked Amara if she was ready. Amara took the pen. Her hand was shaking slightly, but she signed. Whitfield was already moving before the pen lifted off the page, calling out prep instructions, the room shifting back into its operational rhythm like a machine restarting. Within 4 minutes, Amara was being wheeled toward the OR. Camille stood in the pre-op room after everyone else had left. The consent form was gone. The tray table was empty. The monitor was dark. She stood there for a moment in the specific silence of a room that had just held something important and was now just a room again. Then she walked back down the hallway, back to the cafeteria, back to the juice station she'd left half restocked 20 minutes ago. Her supervisor didn't ask where she'd been. Nobody did. She put her earbuds in and got back to work. It started the next morning. Camille was running the breakfast line when she heard it. Not directed at her, but loud enough to carry. 2 residents at the coffee station. The kind of conversation people have when they're not bothering to lower their voices because they don't think the person nearby is listening. "Did you hear about the cafeteria woman who walked into Whitfield's pre-op yesterday? The translator thing? Yeah. I mean, good outcome. Fine, whatever. But that's not really a system, right? You can't just pull random staff off the floor because someone speaks a dialect. Whitfield shouldn't have let her in. That's a liability issue. 100%. What if she'd mistranslated something? What if the patient had asked a question about risks and she got it wrong? You're not a medical interpreter just because you took some night classes. Camille kept moving, tongs in hand, tray to tray. She didn't look up, but she heard every word. By afternoon, the version circulating through the third floor had grown. Someone had added details that weren't true, that she'd pushed her way into the room uninvited, that Diana Torres had tried to stop her, that the consent form had procedural irregularities that legal was now reviewing. None of it was accurate. All of it was spreading. Her supervisor, a man named Gerald who had worked at Grady for 19 years and communicated primarily through paperwork, stopped by the cafeteria at 2 p.m. and told her, without making eye contact, that there had been some questions raised about yesterday and that she should keep her head down for a bit. Questions from who? Camille asked. Gerald looked at the middle distance. Just questions. You know how it is. She did know how it was. This was how it was. She had walked into a room where she wasn't expected, done something that worked, and now the people who hadn't thought to do it themselves needed a way to reframe the story so that her competence became a problem instead of a solution. She had seen this before, not here, but she recognized the shape of it. The work had been right, the outcome had been right, and she was still going to pay for it. The formal review request came on Thursday, not a conversation, a document. 2 pages, hospital letterhead, routed through HR and copied to the department head of food services and the chief of patient safety. The language was careful and institutional. Phrases like unauthorized clinical involvement and potential breach of patient confidentiality protocol and unverified interpretation services, the kind of language designed to sound neutral while building a very specific case. Camille read it twice at the kitchen table that night. Then she read it a third time, slower. The way she read things when she needed to understand, not just what they said, but what they were trying to do. What it was trying to do was reframe a cafeteria worker who had saved a patient's life into a liability who had violated protocol. And the mechanism was elegant in a grim way because every individual claim in the document was technically defensible. She wasn't a certified medical interpreter. She hadn't been formally authorized to enter the pre-op unit. There was no established hospital procedure for what she had done, which meant what she had done existed in a gap, and gaps were dangerous territory for people without institutional protection. The review was scheduled for the following Tuesday, 9 a.m., Conference Room B. She had 5 days. Gerald stopped by her station Friday morning with a second document, a written advisory reminding all food services staff of the boundaries of their role and the importance of staying within their designated areas. It wasn't addressed to her by name. It didn't need to be. She signed the acknowledgement form and handed it back. That afternoon, the hospital's language access coordinator, a woman named Patricia Osei, who had held the position for 7 years and who Camille had never spoken to directly, sent a separate memo to the same HR chain. This one noted that the hospital's contracted telephone interpreter service had been on hold for 20 minutes at the time of the incident, that the hospital's internal language access database had no listing for Criollo, and that the patient had been within 40 minutes of a medically critical window when intervention occurred. It was framed as context. It was context that could cut both ways. Camille read Patricia's memo the same night she got it and understood immediately what it meant. That somewhere in this building, someone with institutional standing was paying attention, not protecting her, not vouching for her, just making sure the factual record was accurate. That was not nothing. But it was also not enough. Because the system wasn't evaluating what had happened. It was evaluating whether the right person had done it. And by every official metric available, Camille Washington was not the right person. She was the woman who worked the breakfast line. The review was in 5 days. She went back to studying. Diana Torres knew exactly what had happened in that pre-op room. She had been there for all of it. The phone interpreter on hold, the tablet with the diagrams Amara kept shaking her head at, the 22 minutes of watching a young woman grip a bed rail and refuse to sign something she couldn't understand. She had been the one who stopped in the cafeteria doorway. She had been the one who said, "Take me to her." She had written none of this in her incident notes, not because she was dishonest, because she was careful. 19 years at Grady Memorial had taught her a specific lesson about what happened to nurses who put their names on documents that contradicted senior physicians. And that lesson had calcified into a reflex she didn't always examine consciously. She thought about Camille on Friday night while she was doing dishes. She thought about the formal review notice she'd received as a named witness and the careful, bloodless language it used to describe what she had watched happen in real time. She thought about the two residents at the coffee station whose conversation she'd also overheard and said nothing about. She thought about Gerald's all-staff advisory memo that everyone understood was directed at one person. She set down the dish she was holding. The thing about Diana Torres was that she was not a coward. She had advocated for patients in rooms where advocating was uncomfortable. She had pushed back on attending physicians when the clinical evidence was clear. She was not someone who looked away easily. But this was different. This wasn't a clinical dispute. This was institutional. And institutional disputes had a way of becoming about the person who spoke up rather than the thing they spoke up about. She had seen it happen. She knew the shape of it. So she was quiet. And her quietness was a weight Camille carried without knowing it. The specific loneliness of someone who has done the right thing in front of witnesses and then watched the witnesses look away. There was one other person who knew the full truth of that morning. Amara Diallo was recovering on the 4th floor. She spoke no English, and nobody had thought to ask her anything. Sunday night, 44 hours before the review, Camille was at her kitchen table with 3 things in front of her. The formal review document, Patricia Osie's memo, and a yellow legal pad she'd been filling since Thursday. The legal pad was the important one. She wasn't writing a defense. She was building a timeline. Every fact she could verify in the order it had happened, with the specific details that made it legible as a sequence of decisions rather than a single unauthorized act. The phone interpreter on hold. She'd confirmed the duration with Diana, who had told her quietly in the hallway on Friday, not as testimony, just as fact. The hospital's Kriolu gap in the language database, Patricia's memo had confirmed that publicly. The 40-minute surgical window that was in Amara's area admission record, which was not Camille's document to have but was also not a secret. She wrote it all down. Then she looked at what she had and understood the problem. The timeline was accurate. The timeline was also insufficient. Because the review wasn't really about what had happened. It was about whether she had the standing to do what she'd done. And no timeline fixed a standing problem. Standing came from credentials, from titles, from institutional recognition, all the things she didn't have and couldn't produce in 44 hours. She set down her pen. The rent letter was still on the corner of the table, face down, 52 days now. She'd stopped doing the daily countdown because it made the number feel smaller than it already was. She thought about the senior coordinator position she had applied for 8 months ago, the one that was still pending, the one Gerald couldn't look her in the eye about. She thought about 12 years of showing up, 12 years of 0 complaints, the 3 commendations in her file that had apparently never moved anyone to do anything. The system sees the uniform, she thought. It doesn't see what's inside it. And the review on Tuesday isn't going to change that, it's going to confirm it. She picked up her pen again. Not because she'd solved anything, because sitting still felt worse. She added one more line to the timeline, a question, not a fact. Who in this building has the authority to confirm language competency outside of a formal certification process? She didn't know the answer, but she knew someone who might. She looked at the clock. 11:20 p.m. Too late to call tonight. She'd have 40 minutes on the bus tomorrow morning before her shift started. She put the legal pad in her bag next to her notebook, set her alarm for 4:48, and turned off the kitchen light. 44 hours. The clock didn't care that she was tired. The answer came from an unexpected direction. Monday morning, 6:20 a.m. Camille was wiping down the steam trays when Patricia Osie walked into the cafeteria, not through the main entrance, through the side door that staff used when they didn't want to be seen coming from a particular direction. She ordered coffee. She stood at the end of the counter. She said quietly, without looking directly at Camille, "The Joint Commission Standards for Language Access in Hospitals, Section 1504 of the Affordable Care Act, and Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Camille kept wiping the tray. "I'm listening," she said. "Hospitals receiving federal funding, which this hospital does, are legally required to provide meaningful language access to patients with limited English proficiency. That requirement doesn't specify who provides the access. It specifies that the access must be provided." Patricia picked up her coffee. The review on Tuesday is framed as a protocol violation, but the actual legal framework doesn't support that framing. Not if the documented facts are accurate. They're accurate, Camille said. I know they are. Patricia paused. The phone interpreter was on hold for 22 minutes. The internal database had no Criollo listing. The patient was within a critical surgical window. Those three facts together don't describe a protocol violation. They describe a system failure that a staff member filled. She looked at Camille directly for the first time. The question Tuesday isn't whether you should have been in that room. The question is why the room wasn't already equipped to handle what walked into it. She left without finishing the coffee. Camille stood at the steam tray for a long moment. The legal framework Patricia had named wasn't a technicality. It was a reframe, a fundamental shift in what Tuesday's review was actually about. And it was the kind of reframe that couldn't be argued against emotionally or dismissed as overreach because it came from federal statute. It existed independent of anyone's opinion about cafeteria workers or hairnets or the proper boundaries of a food services role. It was a fact. One fact. Not enough to win anything yet, but enough to walk into that room on Tuesday and ask a different set of questions than the ones they were planning to ask her. She finished wiping the tray. She added 3 citations to the legal pad that night. Tuesday, 9 a.m., conference room B, 6 people around the table. HR director, department head of food services, chief of patient safety. A woman from legal Camille didn't recognize. Gerald, who was looking at his notepad like it contained something fascinating. And Whitfield, who had requested to attend as a named party and was sitting at the far end with his arms crossed and the particular stillness of someone who has already decided how this ends. Camille sat across from them alone, no union rep, food services didn't have one, no advocate, no lawyer. Just her legal pad, her timeline, and 3 federal citations written in the margin in blue ink. The HR director opened, standard language, the purpose of the review, the nature of the concerns, the importance of maintaining clear role boundaries in a clinical environment. Then she said it directly. Miss Washington, the hospital's position is that your involvement in the pre-op room on Wednesday morning constituted an unauthorized clinical intervention. We're recommending a formal written warning and a mandatory review of your continued employment in a patient-adjacent role. Camille looked at the document they slid across the table. She didn't pick it up. I'd like to ask a few questions before we discuss the recommendation, she said. The HR director glanced at Legal. Legal nodded slightly. Go ahead. Camille opened her legal pad. She asked about the phone interpreter service, specifically the 22-minute hold time documented in the incident log. She asked whether that duration represented a system functioning within standard. The patient safety chief said hold times varied. She asked about the hospital's internal language database, specifically whether Criollo was listed as a covered language. Gerald shifted in his seat. Legal said the database was comprehensive but not exhaustive. She asked about the surgical window, specifically whether the attending physician had documented the time constraint in his pre-op notes. Whitfield uncrossed his arms. Then she said, under Title VI of the Civil Rights Act and Section 1504 of the Affordable Care Act, this hospital is legally required to provide meaningful language access to LEP patients. I'd like to understand which of those requirements was being met in that room in the 22 minutes before I arrived. Silence. Not the silence of people thinking, the silence of people recalibrating. Then Whitfield said, this is not a legal proceeding. No, Camille said. But the law applies regardless of whether we're in a courtroom. Legal was writing something. The HR director looked at the patient safety chief. Gerald was still looking at his notepad. The formal warning was not withdrawn that morning. They tabled the recommendation pending further review, which sounded like a reprieve, but wasn't. Tabled meant delayed. Delayed meant still possible. She walked out of conference room B with no written warning and no resolution and no indication of which direction it would fall. She had done everything right. She was still standing in the same place. That was the part nobody told you about doing the right thing. Sometimes right doesn't land. Sometimes it just buys you more time to keep standing. She rode the bus home in silence. Her mother called that Tuesday night. Camille was on the couch with her shoes still on, legal pad on the cushion beside her, not studying, not doing anything, just sitting in the particular stillness of a person who has used everything they had and is waiting to find out if it was enough. She almost didn't pick up. You sound tired, her mother said. Not a question. I'm okay, Camille. One word. The specific way her mother said her name that meant I've known you for 42 years, and I know what okay sounds like, and that isn't it. She didn't tell her everything. She gave her the shape of it. A situation at work, a review, some people who had decided she'd overstepped. Her mother listened the way she always listened, without interrupting, without offering solutions, just the steady presence of someone on the other end of the line who wasn't going anywhere. When Camille finished, her mother was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You remember Mrs. Fontaine?" Camille remembered. 3rd grade. A teacher who had told her mother at a parent conference that Camille was bright, but needed to learn to be less intense, that she made the other students uncomfortable by knowing too many answers. "Your mother sat in that little plastic chair," her mother said, and she smiled at that woman, and she said, "My daughter will keep being exactly who she is. You're welcome to adjust." Camille didn't say anything. "I didn't tell you that story then because you were 8. I'm telling you now because you're 42, and I think you need to hear that I have never once in your life wished you were less than what you are." The shoes were still on. The legal pad was still on the cushion. Camille looked at the rent letter on the kitchen table, face down where she'd left it 12 days ago. 42 days now. She thought about the 5:15 a.m. bus. The notebook in her apron pocket. 9 languages built one Wednesday night at a time in a community center 12 blocks from a hospital that was currently deciding whether she was a liability. She thought about Amara Diallo on the 4th floor, recovering, alive. She thought about the moment Amara had heard her own language in a room full of people who couldn't reach her. That specific relief, that specific release. And she knew, with a clarity that didn't need anybody's approval, that she would do it again. Every time. "Thanks, Mama," she said. "Go to sleep," her mother said. "You have a bus to catch." She did. The second meeting was called for Thursday. Same room, different energy. This time there were 8 people at the table. The additions, Patricia Osei, who had been formally invited as Language Access Coordinator. A representative from the hospital's legal compliance office, not the same woman from Tuesday, someone more senior, and Dr. James Whitfield, who this time was not sitting with his arms crossed. He was sitting with a folder in front of him. Camille noticed the folder immediately. It was thin, but it was there, and he had brought it himself, and that meant something had shifted between Tuesday and Thursday that she hadn't been told about. The HR director opened the same way. Standard language, pending recommendation, further review. Then the compliance officer spoke. She said the legal team had reviewed the incident against the hospital's obligations under Title VI and Section 1504. She said the review had identified 3 specific gaps: the phone interpreter hold time, the Kriolu language listing absence, and the absence of any documented contingency protocol for rare language emergencies in time-critical surgical situations. She said these gaps predated Wednesday's incident by a significant margin. What that means procedurally, she said, is that the incident in question did not occur because a staff member violated a functioning protocol. It occurred because no functioning protocol existed for this scenario. That's a material distinction. The HR director looked at legal. Legal looked at her notepad. Camille said nothing. She had learned by now that silence in a room like this belonged to the person who could afford to wait. Then Patricia spoke. She had pulled the phone interpreter service logs for the past 18 months. In that period, there had been 7 documented cases where the service had been on hold for longer than 15 minutes during a time-sensitive patient situation. In 3 of those cases, the outcome notes included language like communication barrier, unresolved at time of procedure, or patient, unable to confirm understanding of consent. 7 cases, 3 unresolved. She put the printed logs on the table. The Wednesday incident isn't an anomaly, Patricia said. It's the first time the gap had a consequence that was visible and documentable. That's different from being the first time the gap existed. Whitfield opened his folder. He placed 2 documents on the table. The first was a copy of Amara Diallo's surgical outcome report. Standard post-op documentation, nothing unusual. The second was something Camille hadn't seen before. It was a written statement. 3 paragraphs. Whitfield had written it himself. He didn't read it aloud. He pushed it toward the center of the table and let the compliance officer pick it up. She read it. Then she passed it to HR. Camille waited. HR looked up. "Dr. Whitfield, you're confirming that in your clinical judgment, the intervention by Ms. Washington was," she checked the language, "medically necessary given the circumstances as they existed at that time?" "I'm confirming," Whitfield said, "that without her, the patient would not have consented." Without consent, I could not have operated within the legal and ethical framework of this institution, and without the surgery, the patient's survival was unlikely. He paused. That's not an opinion. That's a sequence of facts. The room was quiet. Then the HR director said, slowly, the way people speak when they're revising something in real time. Then the question of whether Ms. Washington should have been in that room is the wrong question, Whitfield said. The right question is why the room wasn't already equipped to handle it. Camille recognized those words. Patricia had said them to her over coffee at the end of the counter on Monday morning. Whitfield was saying them now at a formal review table, like he'd arrived at them himself. Maybe he had. People sometimes got there. What mattered was that he'd said it on the record. The compliance officer recommended the formal warning be withdrawn. The HR director seconded. Legal noted for the file that the incident represented a stopgap rather than an individual violation and recommended the language access protocol be flagged for immediate revision. Gerald was still looking at his notepad. Nobody asked Camille to speak. She spoke anyway. I want to note, she said, that the 3 commendations in my personnel file, 2 for patient interaction, 1 for crisis response during a kitchen incident in 2019, were never acted on. Not a review, not a conversation, nothing. She kept her voice level. I'm not saying that as a complaint. I'm saying it because if this hospital wants to close the gap that almost cost a patient her life on Wednesday, it has to start noticing what it already has before it needs it. No one responded immediately. Then the compliance officer wrote something down. That was enough. The meeting ended at 10:41 a.m. The formal warning was officially withdrawn. The language access protocol review was assigned to Patricia Osi with a 60-day completion deadline. Camille walked out of conference room B, took the elevator down, and went back to the breakfast line. The system hadn't collapsed under the weight of what was right. It had done something slower and less dramatic. It had corrected, incrementally, the way institutions correct when the documented facts leave them no other direction to move. That wasn't justice, exactly, but it was something you could build on. 3 weeks after the review, Grady Memorial created a new position, Director of Multilingual Patient Advocacy, full-time, benefits. A salary that solved the math on the rent letter completely, with enough left over that Camille stopped moving things around at the end of the month. The announcement was held in the main conference room. Doctors, nurses, administrators, the entire cafeteria staff sitting together in the back row, Marcus, who ran the grill, Yolanda, who had covered her station the morning everything happened, the Tuesday volunteer, who always forgot where the decaf was. They were all there. Diana Torres sat in the 3rd row, still in scrubs, hands folded in her lap. Patricia Osi stood near the door. Whitfield was at the podium. He'd asked to speak. Nobody had stopped him. He said 2 sentences. I laughed at this woman. I was wrong. Then he stepped back and handed her the microphone. Camille looked out at the room. She hadn't changed out of her food services uniform. She'd thought about it on the bus that morning and decided against it. The uniform was accurate. It was what she'd been wearing when it mattered. Changing now would be a kind of revision she wasn't interested in making. She saw Amara Diallo in the front row, recovered, wearing a bright yellow dress, holding flowers, sitting very straight with the particular dignity of someone who has been close enough to the edge to know exactly how solid the ground feels now. Amara caught her eye and nodded once. Camille touched the new badge clipped to her uniform. Director of Multilingual Patient Advocacy. Her name underneath in clean black type. She said 5 words. I was always this person. The room stood up before she finished the sentence. Amara Diallo stayed in Atlanta. She now volunteers as a community health navigator, helping newly arrived patients from West Africa access care in a system that still doesn't always speak their language. She's working on her English. Camille is on her 10th language. She still rides the 5:15 a.m. bus. She still has a notebook in her pocket. The only thing that changed is that now, when she walks through those hospital doors, people look up. The language access protocol was completed in 53 days, 7 days ahead of schedule. Here's the question I'll leave you with. How many Camilles are out there right now, wearing the wrong uniform in someone else's eyes, carrying something nobody has thought to ask about? If this story made you think, share it with someone who needs to hear it.